For 3 days, a retired police dog named Copper refused to leave a grave, his paws bleeding, his eyes pleading. Locals thought it was grief, but Copper wasn't mourning. He was trying to save someone buried alive. What they uncovered beneath the pine-covered soil would shake a quiet town and reveal a miracle no one believed could happen. In a world full of silence and secrets, it took a dog to speak the truth. Whispering Pines was the kind of place where time walked, not ran, nestled in the wooded highlands of northern Colorado. The small town stood wrapped in a blanket of pine and fog, its silence broken only by the rustling of trees or the distant call of a mourning dove. It was early October. The leaves had just begun to turn gold. The air was damp with the ghosts of summer rain, and the wind carried with it the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. At the southern end of town stood the Whispering Pines Cemetery, bordered by wrought iron fences and carpeted in browning grass. Moss curled around old gravestones like green lace, and the silence there was of a deeper kind, a stillness that settled in your lungs when you stepped inside. Eldon Blake had kept that cemetery for more than 2 decades. 72 years old, broad-shouldered and quiet, Eldon was the kind of man who could go entire seasons without saying more than a handful of words. His face folded by time and mountain wind seemed carved from oak. He wore a thick canvas coat no matter the season and a wool cap that covered most of his graying hair. Before this life, Eldon had been a combat engineer in the Army, and after that a man who preferred the company of the dead. He had buried his wife Madeline in the very cemetery he now guarded a loss that had hollowed out the edges of his personality, leaving him both tender and impenetrable. His only living companion was Copper, a retired canine golden retriever. At 7 years old, Copper still carried the bearing of a working dog. His fur was rich gold, darkening slightly along his spine and tail, and lightening at his legs and chest. His eyes were warm, watchful, and remarkably expressive, often filled with a calm intelligence that made strangers instinctively lower their voices when speaking near him. Copper had served in narcotics and search and rescue until a ligament injury had forced his early retirement. He had found sanctuary with Eldon, and over time their rhythms had synchronized like a well-worn song. Each morning, the pair would walk the cemetery together, Eldon with a tin cup of black coffee in hand, Copper a few steps ahead, nose low to the ground, tail swaying like a metronome. It was a peaceful routine, unchanged for months, until the morning of October 9th. The air was colder than usual that day, the kind that bites your skin before the sun rises. Eldon had just opened the cottage door, steam curling up from his coffee when Copper bolted forward down the path, ears perked body, tight a low growl in his throat that Eldon had never heard before. His bark came next, sharp cutting echoing through the pines. Eldon blinked hard. Copper easy now. But the dog was already gone, racing toward the south end of the cemetery. By the time Eldon caught up, Copper was standing rigid in front of a new grave. It was marked with a clean white headstone that hadn't been there long. The soil around it was still damp, and a thin layer of fog coiled low along the base. Copper's body was tense, every muscle activated. He began to circle, sniffing with intensity, and then let out another series of barks shorter, this time, as if trying to communicate something just beyond human understanding. Eldon frowned, shifting his gaze between the grave and the dog. "What the hell's gotten into you?" Before he could move closer, the creak of the cemetery gate caught his attention. A woman stepped through her silhouette, cutting clean against the lifting fog. She walked with steady purpose, a hand casually resting on her utility belt. Her name was Maris Holloway, and her presence was neither random nor unwelcome. Maris was 29 with lean shoulders and long limbs used to movement. She had grown up in Whispering Pines, but left for police training in Denver, only to return 3 years ago after her mother passed from cancer. Her hair was chestnut brown, tied back today in a low bun under her patrol cap. She had the kind of angular face that seemed always on the edge of a frown. Not from unhappiness, but constant calculation. Her uniform was well worn but clean, her boots scuffed and practical. She smiled faintly as she approached Eldon. "I thought I'd find you two out here." Eldon nodded toward the grave, his eyes wary. Something's not right with him this morning. Maris looked toward Copper, who was now standing rigid beside the headstone, staring at it as if expecting it to move. His tail was still, his breathing shallow. Every few seconds he gave off a low rumble of unease. She knelt beside him, hand brushing gently against the fur on his neck. "Hey, partner. You okay?" Her voice softened. There was history in it. Maris had trained with Copper years ago, back when both of them had sharper edges and fewer scars. Copper leaned against her slightly as if for reassurance, but never looked away from the grave. Maris stood wiping her hand against her thigh. "Whose is it?" she asked. Eldon gave a small shake of his head. "New one. Just went in this week, but..." But what she asked? He hesitated. "I don't know. He's never acted like this before. Not for any grave." Maris studied the headstone. No flowers, no markings except the name. They stood in silence for a moment as the wind moved through the trees above. A few pine needles fell like whispers settling into the damp earth. "He's not barking anymore," Eldon said. "He's watching," Maris corrected. "There's a difference." She took a slow breath, her gaze narrowing slightly. "You mind if I hang around a bit?" Eldon shrugged. "Not at all. You're always welcome here," and so she stayed. She leaned against a nearby bench while Copper resumed pacing slowly around the grave, sniffing once then again, then pausing to stare. The sun had started to burn off the fog, and the cemetery began to reveal its quiet corners again. Maris didn't say much. She just watched. Something in her had stirred an instinct, perhaps, or maybe it was just the weight of Copper's focus. She'd seen him find lost children in the woods. She'd seen him freeze at the scent of narcotics buried under 2 feet of dirt. And now she was seeing him do something she couldn't yet name. The morning passed slowly, heavy with silence and suspicion. Eldon eventually went back to the cottage to pour himself another cup of coffee. Maris stayed near the grave. Copper didn't move more than 5 feet away from it. No one said the word strange out loud, but they all thought it. The air in Whispering Pines was colder the next morning. Not just from the seasonal shift, but from something less explainable, something that curled under the skin like a warning. The sky remained clouded, the sun sluggish behind thick banks of gray, and the smell of earth was sharper. Fresher, disturbed Eldon Blake stood at the southern end of the cemetery, his gloved hands buried in his coat pockets, a deep furrow creasing his brow. Before him was the same grave from the day before, the one Copper had not left for more than minutes at a time. This morning the dog sat rigid, tail curled tightly against his hind legs, ears pivoted forward. His front paws showed faint blood on the fur. His claws cracked from yesterday's relentless scratching. Eldon took a slow sip from his thermos and shook his head. "I'm telling you, Maris, I didn't dig that grave. I'd remember." Maris Holloway stood beside him, crouched by the headstone with a small notebook balanced against her thigh. She wasn't in uniform today, but dressed in a dark wool pea coat and jeans tucked into scuffed boots. Her hair was down loose around her shoulders, damp from the morning mist. Her fingers were smudged with dirt as she gently brushed away more soil from the edge of the stone. No fresh sod, no cement liner. She said more to herself than anyone, "Graves shallow." Eldon muttered, "That ain't how we bury people here." Copper gave a low, breathy whine, then resumed pawing at the dirt, ignoring the pain in his injured feet. Maris leaned back on her heels. She had seen shallow graves before, Rushed burials usually unlicensed, sometimes criminal. But this wasn't an open field or desert ground. This was a maintained cemetery watched over by a man who recorded every single burial with military precision. "Do you have your logbook?" she asked. Eldon nodded and pulled it from his coat. The small leather-bound journal was battered but clean, with neat lines of inked entries in crisp cursive. He flipped to the last few pages, eyes scanning. Then he handed it over. Last burial was 2 weeks ago. Section C. Nothing in this quadrant. Maris studied the page. The dates matched his word. She looked up at the grave again. "Then why's this here?" Before either of them could speak further, Copper barked sharply and backed away from the grave, nose high in the air. His tail stiffened. Maris turned just in time to hear the soft rumble of tires over gravel. A dark SUV rolled past the outer edge of the cemetery's north entrance. It was glossy black with deep-tinted windows moving slow. Too slow. The vehicle didn't stop, but it lingered just long enough to send a shiver down Maris's spine. "That's the second time this week," Eldon said grimly. "Same one passed by Tuesday. Thought it might be someone scouting for a plot." Maris didn't respond right away. She followed the car's retreating silhouette until it disappeared around a curve. "People don't scout. Cemetery plots in rental SUVs with government tint," she muttered, then pulled out her phone. Back at the headstone, Copper had begun to whine again, circling tighter and lower, as if he were preparing to dig deeper. Regardless of pain, Maris walked back and crouched beside him, holding his collar gently. "You're hurting yourself, buddy." He pressed his head against her shoulder, panting. "I think he knows something's wrong." Eldon said, voice low. "He never acts like this. Not even when coyotes got into the north fence last winter, I know." She replied, tapping her phone screen, "Which is why I'm calling in backup." She stepped a few feet away and made the call. The voice that answered was deep, smooth, and marked by experience. Gideon Ferris, the town's police chief, had served Whispering Pines for 28 years. A tall black man in his mid-50s, Gideon carried the kind of calm that disarmed most arguments. His beard was peppered with silver, and his uniform always looked slightly too neat to have seen real action, though everyone in town knew he had long ago in bigger cities with bigger problems. "Maris, you're at the cemetery?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "There's something wrong with one of the graves. Unmarked until recently. No log shallow dig. Copper's freaking out." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You think it's vandalism?" "I don't know, but it feels off. And there's been a black SUV circling the cemetery for the past 2 days. Same pattern, slow pass. Never stops. That does sound off. I'd like permission to start a soft probe, quiet. No sirens, no digging yet, just a background trace on the name, and any permits filed in the last week." "You have it," Gideon said. "I'll send someone to cover you. Someone discreet, I'll send. Julian." Maris ended the call, sighing. A few minutes later, she turned back to Eldon. "We're going to handle this quietly for now. You mind keeping the south gate locked tonight?" Eldon nodded. Already planned to. They both looked at the grave again. The white marble headstone read simply, "Michael D. Langford, 2003-2023. No epitaph, no flowers, no record. Copper lay down beside it once more, paws red and raw. He watched it like a sentry guarding something unseen, his golden coat flecked with dirt. His breath steady now, but tense alert. Something about the ground beneath them wasn't resting. Rain had fallen softly through the night in Whispering Pines, soaking the earth until it became sponge-like beneath heavy boots. By morning, the cemetery was cloaked in a quiet fog that hugged the ground like a secret. Birds didn't sing. Even the wind seemed cautious. Maris Holloway stood at the edge of the newly disturbed grave with her jacket collar flipped up against the chill. Her hair, usually pulled back tightly, hung loose today in damp waves along her neck. Her face bore the sharp, focused calm of someone who had learned long ago that fear wasted time. Beside her, Copper waited 7 years old, a golden retriever once trained for police. Canine operations, now retired but restless. He sat still but alert, his nose twitching subtly in the damp air, every muscle attuned to something invisible. The ground had been cleared, and the work crew from county forensics stood ready, glancing between each other with that graveyard quiet respect. Only those who work among the dead understand Dina Estrada. Their lead gave the nod to proceed. Julian Price stood opposite, Maris arms crossed, eyes hard. "You sure we're ready for this?" he asked. "We're never ready," Maris answered. "But we're here." The workers began digging, measured careful. The soil gave way, slowly, thick with moisture. It took nearly an hour before the edge of a wooden box revealed itself. Not regulation. Not even close. Dina stepped forward and motioned her team to help uncover the full length of the coffin. It was plain, unvarnished, and slightly warped from moisture. She dropped to one knee, pried her fingers under the lid's edge, and wedged it loose. It creaked. Maris stepped in closer. A faint sound came from within. Muffled, rasping, "Stop," she said quickly, hand raised. "He's alive." The text froze. Dina immediately dropped down and worked her fingers under the coffin's lip again. "Get EMTs ready now," she called over her shoulder. The lid came off in one swift, splintering motion. Inside lay a young man, pale, sweat-slicked. His wrists and ankles were tied with coarse rope, his mouth taped with several layers of duct tape. His chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow gasps. Julian rushed forward. "We need shears." "I've got it," Maris said, pulling a folding knife from her belt. She cut the bindings cleanly and pulled the tape from the young man's mouth. He coughed violently, convulsing slightly before air rushed into his lungs in great broken gulps. His eyes rolled, blinked, then found Maris's face. "I've got you," she said quietly. "You're safe now. What's your name?" His voice was raw, barely a whisper. "Jude Callahan." Maris stiffened. Dina looked up quickly. "Did he say Callahan?" "Yeah." Maris breathed, "Clayton Callahan's son." Everyone understood the weight of that name. Clayton Callahan, the CEO of Halcyon. Trust, a global giant in digital financial security. The boy in the box was the heir to a cybersecurity empire. EMTs lifted Jude from the coffin with urgent care. They wrapped him in warming blankets and began checking his vitals, but he was stable. Silent now, except for occasional shallow gasps. As they wheeled him away toward the waiting ambulance, Copper growled low and padded toward the now empty coffin. He sniffed hard at the inside edge of the lining, then began to scratch, not violently, but with a kind of anxious insistence. "Hold on," Maris said. She moved to his side and pulled gently at the padding where Copper scratched. Her fingers touched something hard. Buried within the folds was a small item tightly wrapped in black plastic and bound with layers of tape. She tugged it free, palm-sized, light, a USB drive. She stared at it for a long second, feeling Copper's warm breath beside her hand. Jude Callahan had been left for dead, and someone had gone through the trouble of hiding this. The cold air hung over Whispering Pines like a breath held too long. Mist from the recent rain clung to the low tombstones, and muddy ruts curved like veins through the grass. Inside the caretaker's lodge, dim light glowed from a single desk lamp, casting long shadows on the warped floorboards. Maris Holloway sat hunched over a weathered forensic laptop. Her brow furrowed a half-drunk coffee cooling by her elbow. Her damp jacket lay draped on the chair behind her, and her boots left dark circles on the wood beneath. Copper, still damp from the morning's patrol, was curled at her feet. His tail occasionally thumped against the floor with unconscious loyalty, ears flicking at every faint sound. The USB drive she had retrieved, wrapped in layers of electrical tape, and embedded beneath the coffin lining, had taken the better part of the day to decrypt. Now it was open, blinking its grim contents in silent pulses. There was no branding on the device, no metadata, just a folder tree, stark, codenamed and buried under layers of encryption. Maris wasn't a hacker, but she knew enough to read the signs. This was not the work of an amateur. She clicked into a directory labeled Red Echo. What she saw wasn't merely sensitive, it was staggering. Blueprints for software exploits, diagrams of global financial server routes, and overlaying it, all the logo of Sentinel Corp, a contractor she knew provided infrastructure for military and commercial banking operations alike. Her breath caught. She scrolled further. A second document revealed timestamps of future events, systematic backdoor activations scheduled across 4 countries. The files weren't theoretical, they were operational. As she stared at the tangled flowcharts, a phrase repeated like a watermark: the Black Veil Initiative. Behind her, the door creaked open. Eldon Blake entered with a slow, steady gait, his leather work gloves still on. The old groundskeeper always moved like he was navigating headstones even indoors. "You've been staring at that thing for hours," he said, quietly, setting a thermos of coffee next to her. "Whatever it is, it's got your face looking like the sky before a storm." Maris didn't respond at first. She closed the laptop softly and took a long breath. "Something's wrong," she said. "Really wrong." Eldon watched her waiting. She finally looked up. "This drive, it has files linked to Sentinel Corp diagrams, code injections, data rerouting plans. Someone's using their systems to move information stuff. Not even Sentinel Corp knows is being routed. Is that government business?" Eldon asked slowly. "I don't think it's government sanctioned," she said. "But it's federal grade, maybe deeper. There's a group, the Black Veil, they're mentioned in every directory. It's like they've created shadow pathways through legit security systems." Outside, the rain started again, soft but insistent. "And here's the kicker," she added, lowering her voice. "Whispering Pines. This place. It's marked on a route overlay, right under one of the major fiber optic lines running north-south through the region." Eldon blinked. "This ground." She nodded. "Someone chose this cemetery for a reason." Copper lifted his head. At the rising tension in her voice, ears perked. A low whine slipped through his muzzle. Maris reached down and brushed her fingers through his damp fur. "We're standing on a crossroads," she whispered. That evening, as the rain thickened, Maris parked her cruiser behind the main chapel. She walked the ground slowly, Copper by her side. The cemetery's silence pressed inward like a held breath. She'd sent a quiet inquiry to a friend in the Federal Digital Crimes Unit. No specifics, just keywords from the USB. No reply yet. No confirmation. But that was telling too. A rustle by the fence made her pause. A shape, tall, still stood beneath the edge of the trees where the property met the road. Then, in the blink of a moment, it was gone. Vanished between the oaks, Copper growled low. She drew her flashlight, but the beam caught only falling rain and glinting bark. Whoever had left Jude in that box hadn't left the area. They were still watching, still waiting. She returned to the lodge, soaked and silent. Copper shook off the water and padded to his blanket. Maris closed the laptop, stashed the USB in a hidden drawer, and sat beside the window. Outside, fog rolled over the graves like smoke from an unseen fire. The morning sun struggled to break through the thick fog that clung to Whispering Pine Cemetery like a veil. Dew glazed every blade of grass, and the tall pines stood in solemn silence. Maris Holloway stood at the foot of the caretaker's cottage porch, hand resting on the railing, eyes narrowed. Something was wrong. The porch light usually switched on just before dawn was off. The rocking chair that normally creaked with Eldon Blake's early morning ritual sat still. Copper. The 7-year-old golden retriever stood alert beside her ears, perked his body tense as if sensing an absence too sharp to name. Maris knocked once. No answer. She turned the doorknob. It gave easily. Inside, the house was undisturbed in a way that felt too deliberate. The kettle sat cold on the stove, an open crossword half-filled on the kitchen table. Eldon's boots, always polished, waited neatly at the door. His coat hung on its usual peg, but the man himself was nowhere to be seen. "Eldon," she called, voice soft but strained. Copper padded forward, sniffing at the baseboards and around the small back room. The window there had been propped open, screen removed and set aside. Below it, faint impressions marked the ground as if someone had left in haste, but not disorder. No sign of a struggle, but no explanation either. By mid-morning, Sheriff Gideon Ferris had arrived. Standing on the porch with his arms crossed over his broad chest, he looked every bit the small-town lawman, stoic, square-jawed, and lined with age. His flannel shirt clashed with his department-issued badge, and his faded blue jeans bore the dust of too many early mornings spent chasing shadows. "Never missed a morning in 15 years, Gideon said, eyes fixed on the tree line. "And he's not one to take off without a word." "No signs of a struggle," Maris added. "But he didn't walk out the front door either. That back window," it was opened from inside. Gideon's brow furrowed. "You think someone came for him? I think someone wanted him gone." Quietly, Copper barked once, sharp and low. He had returned to the tree line where the footprints vanished among pine needles. Later that day, Maris visited Jude Callahan at Seaforth Community Clinic. He was awake now, bruised but coherent. 22, lanky, with restless eyes, and fingers that drummed an unconscious rhythm on his bedsheet. His hair was short but uneven, as if he'd recently hacked at it himself. The bandages on his arms and chest gave him a ghostly appearance under the fluorescent lights. When she entered, his gaze lifted sharply. "Eldon's gone," Maris said simply. Jude sat up straighter. Gone. Left in the night. No sign of a struggle, but he didn't walk out voluntarily. Jude's jaw clenched. He was the only one who stayed near that grave. The only one who might have heard something, seen something. Which is why I need to ask before you were taken, did anything seem off? "At Argent with your father's systems?" Jude exhaled, hesitating, then said, "Dad asked me to run diagnostics on Sentinel Core's next-gen firewall integration. I had full admin clearance, probably too much. I found something." "Go on a back door," Jude said quietly. "Encrypted hidden deep. It wasn't part of any test build. Someone installed it manually, and it was active, sending periodic bursts of data to external servers. You reported it. I tried, the dev team never responded. I was going to show my dad directly, but they got to me first. I think that's why I ended up in that grave." Maris leaned forward, voice low. "You think your father knows about this?" "I think he suspects more than he lets on. But if he confirms it, it means his whole system is compromised. His legacy, his clients." Maris nodded. "That USB copper found, did it contain your extraction?" "I encoded a copy of the logs." "Yes," Jude said, "but I don't know what they found or deleted before I woke up." The room fell into a heavy silence. Outside, a bird cawed once and fell silent, as if startled into flight by something unseen. As the sun dipped westward, search teams fanned out through the woods, drones circled overhead, officers swept the forest floor for signs of Eldon's path. Copper led one unit nose to the ground, but the scent was fragmented as if Eldon had been carried, not walked, near dusk. Maris returned to the caretaker's lodge. She sat on the porch step watching shadows stretch across the rows of headstones like fingers, reaching for something lost. She replayed every word Jude had said, every clue she'd missed. She knew this wasn't the act of a lone madman. Something more deliberate was unfolding, something that had started beneath their feet, hidden in the soil of Whispering Pines. But tonight, all she had was absence, silence, and a loyal golden retriever who refused to stop watching the trees. The air over Whispering Pines was colder than usual for late October. A dense fog had rolled in from the hills overnight, settling between the tombstones like a shroud. Morning light barely cut through the gloom, lending the landscape a ghostly pallor. Copper, the 7-year-old golden retriever, stood motionless at the edge of the forested slope behind the cemetery, his nose twitching. His fur, a deep golden hue now faded slightly with age, glistened with dew. Without a sound, he moved. Maris Holloway followed close behind. The young officer's boots crunched softly over dead pine needles, her breath visible in the cold. She had pulled her hair back into a tight braid, face alert but composed. Since the discovery of Jude Callahan in the grave 2 days prior, she had learned to trust Copper's instincts even more than her own. The trail Copper followed led to an old chapel, half sunken into the slope and hidden by undergrowth. It had once served as a memorial site, but time and disuse had left it in disrepair. Moss climbed the stone walls. The wooden door was cracked and lopsided. No one had entered it in years at least. Not publicly. Copper paused at the side of the structure, then started pawing at the ground where the chapel met the earth. Maris joined him, and brushing away the leaves and damp soil, uncovered a set of metal grates partially buried. The grates were modern. Too clean, too deliberate. Maris reached for her radio. "Sheriff, I need you and Leah at the chapel. We've found something." Half an hour later, Gideon Ferris arrived dressed in a dark canvas coat and scarf, his hat pulled low over his brow. Behind him came Leah Penn, the town's tech consultant. Short and wiry with wire-rimmed glasses and an ever-present laptop slung across her back. Leah had been a quiet force in the investigation since the appearance of the USB drive. "Let's see what the mutt's dug up," Gideon muttered, crouching to examine the exposed grate. Together, the three of them pulled the metal panel loose. Beneath it lay a vertical shaft with a steel ladder descending into shadow. A faint mechanical hum drifted upward. Leah dropped a glow stick. It fell several seconds before hitting the ground. Maris clicked on her flashlight. "I'm going in first." The ladder was colder than the air outside. The tunnel below was reinforced concrete, lined with power conduits and fiber optic cables. A faint glow came from down the corridor. Copper Agile, despite his age, climbed down after her, using the side rails like he had been trained to in his K-9 days. The corridor curved and widened until it opened into a low-ceilinged underground chamber. The space pulsed with technology. Metal racks full of server banks lined the walls, blinking in steady patterns. Air conditioning units hummed. Overhead, strips of LED lights cast a clinical white glow across the room. But what held them in silence was what stood at the center. A sleek terminal station more sophisticated than anything. Whispering Pines should have been able to host displayed a single screen. On it was a countdown timer. Time to activation. 11 hours. 48 minutes. Leah exhaled slowly, stepping toward the machine. Her fingers hovered over the console. "This is Quantum," she whispered. "A functioning quantum core. This setup isn't just for surveillance, it's designed to act. This thing could manipulate live networks across multiple systems in real time." She knelt, scanning the ports and cables. These data lines, This place is connected actively, and it's been operating quietly beneath our feet for God knows how long. Gideon rubbed the stubble on his chin, staring at the red numbers ticking downward. And the chapel sits on federal data infrastructure, he murmured. It's not just about Jude anymore. Copper padded slowly to a low cabinet beneath the main terminal and sniffed intently. His ears stood upright, his muscles taut. Something behind that panel hummed at a frequency too subtle for human ears. There's more to this setup, Maris said. It's not abandoned, it's waiting. Leah turned pale. This is just a node, it's part of a larger system, but this one, it's a trigger. The team stood in silence as the clock continued to tick down. A heavy fog had rolled in over Whispering Pines just past midnight, swallowing the town in a thick silver murk. Trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches dripping with mist, and the cemetery behind the chapel seemed to hold its breath. The countdown clock in the underground chamber ticked ominously onward. Less than 4 hours remained. Inside the operations hub beneath the chapel, Maris Holloway paced in a slow, tight circle. Her fingers clenched around her radio. Her face, usually calm and composed, now carried an edge of urgency, her jaw set with determination. Still no signal from Eldon, she muttered. He's been off-grid for nearly 2 days. Copper sat beside her, his eyes sharp in the dim glow of the server lights, though his body showed the wear of age graying around the muzzle, and slight limping from the cold ground, his posture remained alert. At the mention of Eldon's name, the golden retriever's ears flicked, and he gave a low, intent growl. Eldon Blake, the old groundskeeper, had become something of a legend in Whispering Pines. Stocky and weather-beaten, with a long, wiry beard and a limp from a fall. Years ago, he was known for remembering every corner of the cemetery's winding paths. More than that, Eldon knew about the older layers of Whispering Pines, the forgotten tunnel systems built during the Cold War, when the area had been considered a backup communications site. That knowledge now made him a target. Morris turned to Jude Callahan, seated at a folding desk, his fingers flying across a compact keyboard. Jude, pale, thin, early 20s, had regained strength steadily over the past day. His sandy hair was disheveled, and his cheeks still bore scratches from the grave, but his mind was razor-sharp. "I'm in their command matrix," he said, voice low but focused. "They've got Eldon stashed near the northeastern tunnel junction. There's motion data and biometric pings that only match his profile. He's alive, but guarded." Sheriff Gideon Ferris stood over the digital map on the wall, his tall frame casting a shadow across the display. His deep voice rumbled as he studied the red dots moving across the map. "Then we hit that junction and get him out. We don't have time for hesitation." Leah Penn adjusted her glasses, peering at her tablet. "We can cut their external surveillance loops for a 10-minute window, maybe 12. Any longer, and they'll notice." "That's our shot." The team moved fast. Outside, the fog gave them cover as they slipped through the side gate of the cemetery and entered the overgrown trail. Copper led the way, nose to the ground, body taut. The trees muffled sound, and visibility was no more than a few feet. It was perfect terrain for both predator and prey. They reached an old maintenance shaft near the chapel's rear perimeter. Leah bypassed the digital lock with a flick of her wrist and a soft click. The door swung open, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. Maris descended first, followed by Gideon. Leah and Copper Jude remained at the chapel, plugged into their comms, acting as mission support. "You're approaching their firewall now." His voice crackled in their earpieces. "Eldon's heat signature is in the southern alcove." 2 guards, moving slow. The tunnels felt colder here, narrower and older. Moisture beaded along the stone, and the air carried a slight metallic tang. At one junction, Copper stopped. His body stiffened, hackles raised, and with a sudden burst, he lunged into the shadows. A figure clad in black tactical gear stumbled out from behind a pillar, caught off guard by the dog's momentum. Copper's weight knocked him to the ground with a dull thud. The man reached for a sidearm, but Copper bit down hard on the wrist, disarming him. Maris arrived seconds later, weapon drawn. "Don't move," she ordered, cuffing the attacker with practiced efficiency. "Black Veil," Gideon muttered, checking the man's patch, a small silver emblem shaped like a veil fluttering in wind. No doubt. Now, they advanced deeper until they found a locked steel door behind which the thermal scanner read one seated figure. Eldon. Maris tapped her mic. "Jude, we need access." Working. Okay. Sending a spoof signal. Doors open now." The bolt clicked. Gideon kicked it open, and they rushed inside. Eldon sat bound but alert. His eyes, tired but fierce, widened with relief. "You took your time," he rasped. "They're trying to dig under the mainframe chamber. They think there's an auxiliary core there. We're shutting it down," Maris said, cutting his bonds. "You're getting out with us." But just as they turned to exit, alarms blared. Jude's voice flared into their comms. "They know. Someone just bypassed my loop. You have 3 minutes before reinforcements converge." "Then we move fast," Gideon growled. They retraced their steps, but a sharp clatter of boots echoed down the tunnel ahead. Backup had arrived. Leah pointed to a side corridor. "This way." "It's tight, but it loops to the chapel access hatch." They sprinted down the cramped hall, Copper leading again. Behind them, shouts rose and footsteps closed in. At one sharp turn, a masked man lunged from the foggy corridor. Copper didn't hesitate. He charged, teeth bared. The force of his leap knocked the attacker off balance long enough for Gideon to slam him into the wall. Leah opened the final door, and they emerged into the chapel basement. Gasping, Jude was waiting with a wired terminal. "I've isolated the signal path." "You're just in time. We need to cut the core link now before they reroute it." Eldon limped over, staring at the terminal with bloodshot eyes. "Disable the bypass first. Otherwise, they'll loop the signal through the auxiliary uplink under the hill." Maris nodded. "Tell us how." Together they followed Eldon's instructions. Copper, still panting but unshaken, sat near the panel, eyes watching the countdown clock. It had dipped below 2 hours. The system flickered. Leah's fingers moved in sync with Jude's remote commands. Then, with a final key press, the uplink froze. The lights dimmed, the countdown vanished from the screen. Everyone stood still. Silence. No klaxons. No movement. Just the sound of breathing, and Copper's tail gently thumping against the floor. The fog had lifted by morning, leaving behind dew-glazed grass and the soft hush of birdsong across the cemetery. Whispering Pines stood quiet again, its gravestones bathed in gentle sunlight. No longer a battlefield of shadows and buried secrets. But beneath the earth and within its people everything had changed. At the town square, a modest ceremony had gathered. Residents, officers, and veterans stood side by side, their breaths fogging in the crisp autumn air. Banners bearing the emblem of Sentinel Corps flanked the podium, and a new bronze plaque gleamed in the morning light. "In honor of Copper, a protector until the end." Copper sat proudly near the stage, his golden coat brushed clean and gleaming. At 7 years old, the former K-9 had the dignified calm of a soldier who had seen too much, yet still believed in the good, though a slight limp remained from his earlier clash. His eyes sparkled with alertness, and his ears twitched at every name spoken. Maris Holloway stood behind the podium, her uniform freshly pressed new sergeant stripes on her shoulder. She spoke with a calm, clear voice. Not rehearsed, just honest, heroes come in many forms. Some carry guns, some carry burdens. Some, she paused, glancing at Copper, carry nothing but faith. Applause followed, quiet and reverent. In the crowd, Jude Callahan stood with his father, Clayton Callahan, CEO of Sentinel Corps, a man once feared for his cold, calculated business decisions. Today, he looked different. Clayton was a tall, square-shouldered man in his 50s, always in tailored suits, but the hard lines of his jaw had softened. The ordeal had aged him in ways more profound than time. He kept one hand on his son's shoulder, perhaps to ground himself in a world he had nearly lost. Jude, still pale, but stronger. Each day wore a navy sweater and dark jeans. His eyes held a new maturity, no longer the boy who had hidden stolen data, but a man who understood the cost of truth. He had spent the past week helping Sentinel Corps rebuild their systems, not just patching code, but rewriting entire segments to close vulnerabilities. We should have listened sooner, Clayton admitted quietly to Maris after the ceremony. Sometimes it takes losing everything to see what's broken. To atone, Clayton had announced the founding of Copper's Haven, a veterinary hospital and rehabilitation center for retired service dogs. It would be built at the edge of town near the old train depot. The land had already been cleared. "We owe more than medals to those who serve," he had said. "We owe them dignity." Later that afternoon, Maris walked along the stone path of the cemetery, the grass damp underfoot. Eldon Blake stood by the new wooden fence at the south end, hammer in hand, fitting the final board in place. His beard was a little fuller, his posture still crooked from the old injury, but there was light in his eyes again. He turned as she approached. "Didn't think I'd be back here this soon." "You belong here," she said. "This place, it listens to you." Eldon nodded, whispering, "Pines doesn't forget, it buries secrets." "Sure, but it also remembers who stood when others ran." Copper padded forward, brushing against Eldon's leg. The old caretaker scratched behind his ear. "You're not done yet, are you, boy?" Marissa smiled. "I don't think he'll ever be." Down by the newly marked plot where Jude had been found, a row of fresh flowers had been laid, white daisies, symbols of innocence reclaimed. No names, just a single stone etched with, "Let the light find us again." As the sun dipped westward, casting golden light across the grass, children ran near the pond where the geese swam, and old couples sat on benches with warm cider in hand. Life had returned. At Copper's side, a young boy stepped forward. Benjamin Ryder, son of local baker. Sarah Ryder, who had helped organize the town's aid during the blackout. Benjamin was shy no more than 8, with freckled sandy hair and an earnest smile. "Can I pet him?" he asked Maris. Copper wagged his tail before she could answer. "Looks like you already have permission." Benjamin knelt beside Copper, wrapping his arms gently around the dog's neck. For a long second, the world paused. No sirens, no codes, no fear. Just a boy and a dog. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or angels. Sometimes they come wrapped in golden fur with tired paws and a heart that never quits. Copper wasn't just a dog. He was a reminder that loyalty, courage, and quiet faith can move mountains and even stop chaos from swallowing the world. In the darkest tunnels beneath whispering pines, when the systems blinked and time ran out, it wasn't technology that saved the day. It was trust. Trust in a companion who listened deeper than words, who followed the scent of danger, not for glory but for love, and maybe it was God's gentle hand guiding that dog through every shadow, reminding us that we are never truly alone. Let this be a reminder in our everyday lives. Even when the world seems too complex, too fast, or too far gone, there are still moments of grace. Still voices whispering truth. Still people and dogs willing to stand in the storm and say, "Not today." So if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who still believes in faith and loyalty. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that speak to the soul. Leave a comment below and type Amen if you believe God sends the right help at the right time. May the Lord bless you and keep you safe. And may we all be a little more like Copper Faithful, fearless, and led by love.